Good evening and welcome. My name is Sarah Kerr and I'm delighted to welcome you here to tonight's panel discussion, Developing Dublin. I extend my welcome to all of you here in the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute and to those of you watching us online. Tonight's panel discussion is part of a lecture series organised by Dr. Tom Walker in the School of English and Dr. Daniel Fass in the Department of Sociology and myself here in Trinity. And it is supported by the Trinity Long Room Hub Arts and Humanities Research Institute, to whom we're very thankful. The lecture series is called Trinity and the Changing City, and through 6 sessions over the course of the academic year covering a variety of topics, we will explore Dublin's past, its development into the city it is today, and indeed its future. Our motivation for this lecture series is to address our representative gap, and by that I mean a gap between the real city in which Trinity resides, with its diversity, languages, social class and race, and the narratives within broader culture that the city puts forth. And the session this evening aims to address this gap by bringing together Trinity's staff and stakeholders within the city. The topic of developing Dublin will be explored through a discussion on some of the major developments taking place within the city, and I suppose the juxtaposition of those against the many vacant buildings which remain, all of which is set within a context of a city historically rich creatively and in culture. So we have 3 speakers this evening. Each will deliver their presentation, after which I will open the floor for questions. So please jot down your questions during the talk and save them for the Q&A at the end. So I'll now introduce all 3 speakers so we can get stuck into the discussion. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Melanie Hayes. Dr. Hayes is an architectural and cultural historian in the Department of History and Art and Architecture here at Trinity. Melanie's research focuses on Ireland's 18th century architectural and social history, specifically Dublin's early Georgian domestic architecture, which resulted in her involvement with the conservation project 14 Henrietta Street as a historical consultant. And we actually explored that topic in the first session of this lecture series, so we're delighted that Melanie's here this evening. Our second speaker is Mr. Ger Casey. Ger is an architect with over 20 years experience. He was a key member of the design team that developed the award-winning master plan for the Grangegorman urban quarter. He has since been working for the Grangegorman Development Agency to help implement the master plan vision, fulfilling several different senior roles within the GDA, the most recent of which being his current position as Chief Executive Officer. Our third and final speaker this evening will be Dr. Cian O'Callaghan. Dr. O'Callaghan is an urban and cultural geographer in the Department of Geography at Trinity. His recent research has focused on the impacts of Ireland's property crash on the built environment and society, and on the transformations taking place in the post-crisis city, particularly in relation to the meaning and use of vacant spaces. So you're all incredibly welcome here this evening, and I now invite Dr. Hayes to give her talk. To begin this evening by looking back and thinking about the development of Dublin's premier Georgian street, or residential street, now Parnell Street. It's easier. Once Dublin's premier residential street, O'Connell Street Upper, formerly Sackville Street Upper and Gardiner's Mall, stands as a testament to the cyclical fortunes of the city's architectural heritage. A series of booms and busts, of changing functions, occupancy and vacancy have all left their mark on the historic fabric of the city. This evening I'm going to speak briefly about the original development in the mid-18th century before plotting the changing use, destruction and decline of Dublin's principal thoroughfare. Built in the boom times of the 1750s, Sackville Street Upper was a pioneering example of high-class domestic development. The man responsible for this ambitious endeavour was a property tycoon by the name of Luke Gardner.
He was a high-ranking government official, politician, private banker, and over the course of his long career, Gardner amassed a large property portfolio in Dublin City and beyond, having bought up vast swaths of land on the north side of the River Liffey in the 1720s. This land once belonged to St Mary's Abbey and later to the Earls of Drogheda. Gardner's own speculative enterprises, which included the exclusive residential development of Henrietta Street and those of his descendants, would change the face of the North Georgian city forever. Cavendish Row and Granby Rows, Gardner and Blessington Street, and the intended flagship of their enterprise, Mountjoy Square, all immortalise the Gardner family name still today. Returning to Sackville Street, development began here about 1748-1749, and this was a time of increased prosperity, following a decade of war abroad and famine and hardship at home. At this time, interest rates were unusually low, and demand for upper-class housing was on the rise. Works here in Sackville Mall coincided with smaller-scale developments in the vicinity, Marlborough Street, Moore Street, and Great Britain Street, or Parnell Street today. Sackville Street was to be the jewel in the crown, setting new standards in the city's urban planning. We see here a vast boulevard stretching a massive 1,050 feet in length and 150 feet wide, lined on both sides with these lofty terraced houses and an elegant mall or walking place laid down the centre. This was of a scale and sophistication unprecedented in the Georgian city, even rare at this time in London. It would not have been out of place in the imperial capitals of Europe in the later century to come. You see here in this map of 1756 the broad open aspect of the street, and it would have stood in stark contrast to the cramped conditions of the old city on the other side of the river. Sackville Street and Mall became a focal point and indeed the impetus for subsequent development in the northeast quadrant of the city. But before any building works could commence, major site clearance had to take place. Demolition of earlier structures around the end of what was then Drogheda Street and Earl Street. And still at the mid-century, Drogheda Street closed off the end of Sackville Street to the river. In the 18th century, even the removal of debris and building waste was a very costly affair, and the provision of services, most of which Gardner left for future residents to pay and petition for, as well as paving and landscaping had to all be considered. Gardner was a seasoned developer, and instead of footing the bill for this entire development, he parcelled out smaller lots of ground, many of which he sublet to building tradesmen, craftsmen, at very favourable rates. He often let them at a nominal peppercorn of a rent for a set building term. And these tradesmen in turn carried out the building works thereon before selling the houses, or the new built houses, onto their wealthy residents. In other instances, Gardner kept control of construction here, contracting architects and builders himself, and even granting mortgage finance to prospective tenants as a means of encouraging speedy development, ensuring the right calibre of residents, who he ensured leased these new built properties at the highest rates the market would bear. The resulting houses, with their plain red brick facades, punctuated by evenly set back windows, parapet roofs above, rather sombre stone door cases below, and railed-in areas before the basements at street level, lent an air of sophistication, of uniformity to the scheme, in line with prescribed Georgian ideals. We have to allow here, however, for an element of artistic licence to the homogeneity seen in Grace's view of about 1752. Many of the buildings here at that time were still under construction. As I say, some of this must be his imaginings, but concrete evidence of the external treatment of the original Sackville Street is very thin on the ground. A rare single reference survives in a lease of May 1750 between Luke Gardner and the Reverend Edward Bailey, wherein Gardner agreed to build walls or a shell of a building of good and sound and merchantable honey brick. So not the red brick we'd expect to see, suggesting there was an element of variety, of colour, of materials, but that's all we can really determine aside from this artist impression. We know that there was variety in terms of scale, from a broad 60 feet frontage at this corner plot at number 9 and 10 Sackville Street, the residence and adjoining counting house of Alderman Richard Dawson, the banker. And from that broad site to much more modest proportions of number 20 at the Reverend Bailey's house of only 27 feet to the street in front. Similar to their scale, although these houses presented a very similar face to the street, internally there was much variety in terms of their layout and in terms of their decoration. And I apologise for these images, but this is all that remains. This is the only evidence we have of these interiors taken in the early years of the 20th century. But we can tell from the surviving evidence that there were some exceptional examples, particularly on the east side of the street. Here showing Drogheda House, where some of the 18th century schemes, the original schemes in this house, survived right into the 20th century. Another important example at number 15, also on the east side of the street, 15 and 16, a pair of houses built for Robert Hancock. The design of these two houses and of several of the other early houses on the street are attributed to Richard Castle, the leading architect of the day. Castle had close connections both with Gardner and with his protege and co-developer Nathaniel Clements. And he was also connected with many of the notable residents and individuals of this street. Castle died in 1751, and after this time, works would have been carried out by his right-hand man, his lieutenant, John Enser. Many of the other houses, which were of equal scale and internal pretension, were speculatively built affairs by local tradesmen, the Darleys, the Balls, the Buckleys, and Stewart. These men formed so-called building knots, operating a sort of quid pro quo system, constructing a number of houses on the west side and lending each other services in alternate projects. All of the houses, both bespoke or speculative builds alike, were elegant domestic spaces, and they all served a variety, an array of functions, practical and symbolic. There were family dwellings, and there were places for entertainment, from large-scale social gatherings to more intimate political interludes, where overt displays of luxury and opulence were the order of the day. And these spoke volumes about the status and the sophisticated taste of their occupants. As well as the houses, the mall or walking place, which was a sort of elongated urban square where lent an air of grandeur to this scheme. It derives its name from the game of mall or croquet, and it was created, and I quote you from a lease at the time, for the use and pleasure and accommodation of the tenants and inhabitants of these houses, also their servants and followers, and any other persons who think fit to pass and repass through the same. So essentially a public space that we can see here, walled in, slightly separate. It was a place of promenade, of public resort for elites to be seen in the centre of the city. We can see here that Gardner, in creating the mall, drew on the latest fashions from Britain and the continent. The mall was originally walled in, enclosed in these low stone walls, topped or capped with cut stone and dotted around its perimeter with lamps and these obelisks. Examples of the latter still survive in the Rotunda Gardens just to the north of this street. So very elegant and sophisticated, drawing on British and continental European models. The mall was later planted with trees, gravel walks, and surrounded by handsome iron railings. These were removed in the 19th century, while many different statues have inhabited this spot over the centuries, the first being Van Nost's William Blakeney. An elegant fountain also stood at the north of the Mall, and also removed in the early 19th century because of issues with ice and slipping, public safety in the early 19th century. In a covenant or an agreement made between Luke Gardner and one Charlton Whitlock in 1755, it was laid down or agreed that this mall, the said ground, shall forever and hereafter remain a mall or walking place, and shall ever remain free and open and continue unbuilt upon for no other intent or purpose whatsoever. And though its original appearance has changed over the centuries, the outline of Gardner's Mall can still be felt in our modern streetscape. This street was described in 1787 as the best and most spacious street in Dublin, inhabited chiefly by the nobility of the kingdom. And Sackville Street certainly boasted a range of elite entitled residents, from the Dowager Countess Netherville to Viscount Lifford, the Lord Chancellor of Ireland. But even at the outset, there was an element of mixed use on Sackville Street, with a gravel pit belonging to one John McGill, aka Buttermilk Jack, and he owned this gravel pit on the west side of the street up until 1767, when 3 houses were built on it by the stonemason George Darley. So to say, we can see mixed use right from the outset. Moving on to the 19th century, we start to see even more variety and change in terms of use. Following the Act of Union and the subsequent exodus of MPs and peers from the city, Dublin's principal thoroughfare was occupied by a growing professional class. These had already begun to infiltrate this exclusive enclave even at the end of the century. A more commercial air emerged, similar to the lower half of the street, which had been built in 1784, and according to the historian Maurice Craig, vulgarised the exclusive tenor of the Mall. By now, it had become the city's premier commercial street. In 1805, there were some 40 businesses listed at Sackville Street. Many of the original houses were then subdivided or knocked through, used as clubhouses, such as the Sackville Club, or the Catholic Commercial Club on the west side of the street. They were also used as hotels and distilleries, such as the Gresham and the Waterford hotels, and later the Hammond's Hotel, or Hammond's Family Hotel, and Turkish Baths. And this part of this hotel stood on the site of where Colonel Owen Wynn's house once stood in the middle of the 18th century. Externally and internally, many of these Georgian homes were altered and adapted to suit these new uses and changing tastes. Alderman Dawson's house, probably the finest house on the street, was subdivided into 2 in the 1820s and occupied by William Curry's booksellers and publishers, before it was taken down and rebuilt entirely in 1867 by the Scottish Provident Insurance Company. On a whirlwind of time, the 20th century saw even more drastic change at O'Connell Street, with damage and destruction of many of the original buildings, which were caught in the line of fire, firstly during the 1916 rebellion, and even more so during the Civil War in June of 1922, when rebel forces occupied the buildings and were subsequently shelled. Nearly the entire of the east side of Upper Sackville Street was destroyed at this time, and this map gives you an indication of the devastation that was wreaked on the historic and built fabric of the urban core. Here we can see the cleared site in 1925 where the Gresham Hotel once stood. So massive destruction to historic fabrics. And the subsequent rebuilding of the newly renamed O'Connell Street by the new Irish state proved to be quite a dull exercise in neo-Georgian pastiche, rigorously controlled at that time by the city architect Horace T. O'Rourke, who prescribed set building lines, parapet heights, classicising frontages to the street. It brings us to what remains today. There are vestiges of the original buildings which survive in places, and you do need to look carefully. You do need to look up. Concealed in these instances here, behind later additions, refacing, signage, etc. Of the original development, only one of the 18th century houses survives intact, relatively speaking, standing alone amid amusement arcades and vacant lots. The sole survivor, number 42 O'Connell Street, was built about 1752 for Dr. Robert Robinson. He was a state physician and a professor of anatomy at Trinity College. He was a very well-connected player in the city's political and social circles. Richard Castle is again credited with the design of this building, if not the execution, which of course was likely carried out by John Enser, who was then involved in other works in this northwest corner of the street. The resulting building is one of considerable pretension and exceptional architectural quality, from the very stark grandeur of its well-proportioned facade, punctuated by these very widely spaced sashed windows, enriched only by this tripartite Doric stone door case at the street level. Internally, the controlled movement through a sequence of varied spaces, transitions in light and darkness, creates a very dramatic interior, arched, vaulted spaces, culminating in the drama of this bowed staircase compartment on the rear of the building. All of this speaks of the skill of its creator and the calibre of this work. The remaining remnants of finely crafted joinery, exquisite stucco schemes, evoke a very powerful sense of the original magnificence within. For although the fabric of the house has undergone various modifications over the centuries, when it served as offices for the Royal Agricultural Society, the Farmers' Club, Catholic Commercial Club, and later incorporated into the Royal Dublin Hotel. Some really, really fine examples of decorative plasterwork by the Dublin School survive, again, relatively intact. These have been attributed to the master stucador, Robert West. And here we can find remains of once vigorous acanthus leaves scrolling boldly over the wall surface, tendrils of vines and foliage clinging almost for dear life onto what's now exposed ceilings. Enormous birds, some of them are real, some of them are the stucco variety, peer down into these empty spaces. They're now the only occupants of these once magnificent rooms. It's because of this architectural merit, and indeed the work of activists in highlighting the national historic significance of this building, the number 42 has survived and its preservation has been ordered. But in the Georgian Society records published in 1911, which is our best source of information on the architectural history of this street, it details and illustrates significant elements and interiors of the vast majority of properties on this street. And it all but glosses over number 42. It doesn't deal with it in terms of description at all. So perhaps number 42 was not so exceptional an example after all, when viewed in the larger context of the street. A point that takes nothing from the significance of this building, but rather underscores the quality of what we have lost, the importance of preserving what remains for this and other examples of the city and indeed the country's architectural heritage. Now vacant and more than a little forlorn, with a gaping lot on one side and the remnants of O'Connell Hall, a theatre built for the Catholic Commercial Club, ensconced in the rear of it. Number 42 is the last vestige of an important Georgian city, a development which waits for another building boom to restore its dignity. Thank you.
evening, everyone. Okay, what I'm going to talk to you about is just about Grangegorman, which is the project myself and Conor, who's sitting there in row 3 in the middle there, looking home. We're looking after. It's something that we've been working on for about 10 years. At least I've been working on for about 10 years. Others have been on it since the mid-90s. So it's a particular piece of Dublin City that has been left alone for a while, and now we're trying to re-engage it and knit it back into the city. So one of the things that has come up time and time again as part of this development is the theme, or the piece about making connections and new connections, or making reconnections. So that's something that's just going to come up throughout the whole piece. So for those of you who don't know, this is where Grangegorman is. I only discovered it was a real place myself when I was about 19 or 20. It was a sort of a threat for me growing up. I grew up a couple of miles up the way, and that's where most of my family are from. It was something that when you were in school, you sort of said, you're going to end up in Grangegorman. It was a place that was in your mind, it was something, but as a physical place, it was somewhere where people didn't really know where it was. It was disconnected. So it's about a 73-acre site. This is it here. On the left-hand side is North Circular Road heading towards Phibsborough. Here is the Prussia Street piece in the bottom right-hand corner, and you'll see O'Connell Street, the black dotted piece, the Liffey on the top right-hand corner, on O'Connell Street. So it's right in the heart of the city, but yet it's not on everyone's mind map even now. So I'm going to talk about that. This is the city as it was, or sorry, the site as it was. We think around the late 1940s. There would have been around 2,000 patients on site at this point. It was a self-contained piece. If you were in there, you generally never got out. This is what the wall was like when, this is from 10 years ago. You know, you didn't know what was going on beyond it. It was the first penitentiary in the British Isles, this building I work in there with Conor at the moment. It was something that was, as you say, disconnected and confusing. This was the site as I was working on it here around 2010. There's these random signs left around, random bits of its history just left to decay. This is an aerial shot taken of the site around 2006, and picking up on the building number 42 on O'Connell Street. Most of the occupants of this site were pigeons. There was about 100, 200 people using this site, those 73 acres, on any given day. About 100 and 130 people with patients, then some HSE staff. So it was a very underutilised asset. The nature of the road network around it and through it meant that it was very, very hard to locate. It wasn't on anyone's daily route. On the western boundary you have Prussia Street. It was through over the back of houses. On the eastern boundary you have this great big landmass occupied by buses and cars, which is in the ownership of the CIE. So it's an impenetrable piece. You might on occasion find yourself coming down Rathdown Road and coming down through here, but the way the traffic is mapped out, it's not something that you'd use in a rat road even today. So it's not something you came across accidentally. So it was a hidden treasure. This is a drawing that was prepared at the start when we were doing our master plan by an architect, Tony Tran, in Santa Monica in California. He was trying to get his head around Dublin. Now, he'd never been there, he didn't come to visit as part of the development of the master plan. But it was kind of, we tried to explain to him over the phone what we thought was the city core. So this is how we saw the city core, where the darker shade was. We know the canals, the North Circular, the circular roads, etc. That's kind of seen as the traditional city piece. And it was sort of interesting when he gave us this drawing back, where you could see the fine network of streets and connectivity across and through the city. And then you had, on the kind of the western edge of the city, there's all these institutional land banks that have meant that the western part of the city is never really truly integrated into the eastern part, dominated by O'Connell Street. And the Docklands now coming through, and obviously the College Green Dame Street piece. So one of the things that we did when we in the first meeting, the first design sketch, myself, John Rubel, James Mary O'Connor and John Mitchell did when we were figuring out what the hell do we do with this, what's our first hook for the design competition. And we all came to the conclusion pretty quick, well, we had to break through, we had to get into the site, we had to make it permeable, we had to stitch it into the city. So this is one of the drawings we created during the master plan, was just showing loads of arrows breaking through, looking at every opportunity to break into the site and bring it back into the city, as I say, and make connections. So this is the master plan itself. This is the drawing we finished up with around 2007. Now the master plan itself and the urban redevelopment is driven largely by the relocation of DIT to Grangegorman. That drives more than half of all the development space on there. There's about 400,000 square metres mapped out on that. So it's one thing to map out all of those uses and all of those physical spaces onto a site, but there's all these other things that we were trying to address. And that came through from the original concepts of what could happen with Grangegorman, which is driven by things that came from the civil service back around the late 1990s and the early 2000s, when there was working groups set up from the Department of Taoiseach and down, and they were looking at what can you do. There's a lot of ideas about what you do. You could just sell it out in the open market, or you could put a hospital on it, or you could put museum spaces, or what would you do with it? And they came up with the idea of relocating DIT, because DIT was all this in lots of little tiny buildings all around town. They were in 39 different locations. Consolidated that into one. That made an awful lot of sense. There was also the institutional healthcare for all the people on site. They were all in pretty much Dickensian facilities. They needed new facilities. Primary care facilities needed to happen. There was the vision for change for mental health. So all of these kind of policies could all be realised in one location, as well as all these other policies around urban planning, urban design, sustainability, etc. So from an architect's point of view, what we wanted to do was use all of this stuff to drive new, vibrant places. We wanted to change fundamentally the meaning of the name Grangegorman from something that was a threat to something that where I'd like to go there. I'd like to go and study there. I'd like to go live there. I'd like to, make it a positive place. We had to give us, where we had a lot of debate as to how it would develop over time. Like O'Connell Street, we wanted to see, we wanted vibrancy in its architecture. We wanted different architects to come on and produce different buildings, but with a coherent sense of place. We wanted to bring the South City and the landscapes beyond back into this. This drawing was really inspired by James. James did this drawing, and it's got the Chinese idea of the border landscape and bringing all of the city back in. The location of Grangegorman is fundamental to its success, hopeful success, I'd say. If you imagine Dublin as a shallow bowl, Grangegorman is literally on the lip of that bowl. So where you are, once you go any way above ground level, you've got these fabulous views overlooking the city. So we wanted to make sure that all these buildings captured all of that as best as possible. We also have access to prevailing winds, southwest prevailing winds. We have to take on board sustainability measures with climate change. And we wanted to have them embedded into the structure and the fabric of the urban forms, so that we minimised, no matter what, the reliance on mechanical systems. So all these levels of thought had to go into it. And we ended up with this as our ultimate vision. Dominated by, as I say, education facilities through the main core, residential facilities for students coming through quads here and then wrapping through a main street, and then to the north where a lot of the residential facilities are, we have a lot of healthcare and a primary school, all co-located beside each other. So everything had its place, and there was a lot of thought went into it. This is one of our first buildings that we did. This is a primary care facility we developed there with Taylor Architects. One of the things we wanted to do was look at how the old and the historic nature of the site could be respected, restored, but given a new use and a new life with new facilities. This is that building there, the laundry building, as it was back in the 40s and 50s. It's a building that has quite a sad history, as with the rest of the site. Its last use was industrial therapy, which doesn't sound all that attractive, and it wasn't. One of the last things that happened to them before they closed it was, unfortunately, one of the patients committed suicide by tying a lot of ties together and hanging himself from the rafters. So it was just, there's a very, very heavy, sad history to it. So when we came in, that's the state of the building there. It was in quite dilapidated form. In that particular bay, funnily enough, there was an old rubber plant that had just grown out and taken over the entire bay. It was in bits. So we had to take all this and give it a new meaning and give the whole building new life. So we were grateful to be able to do that now with the HSE. They gave us a brief to do it, and these are just some shots of the finished product now. It's now open now about a year, working very well. And you know, we found obviously some parts of the heritage. We tried to bring that back as best as possible into it. That's something we were trying to do as well with the rest of the site. So what you see there in front of you is the entrance, the only entrance to the site that was being used by anyone accessing it. It was those gates were originally the entrances to Santry Domain out in Ballymun. They're from the 1780s, I think. And the gates, curiously, it was only when we took them down to refurbish them we realised they're probably the best example in Ireland of a type of iron forge work that was particular to Ireland. So when we got them down, a lot of people were very excited about these, and we had them specifically refurbished. And we tried to change the meaning of that entrance. There was a lot of call for kind of memorialisation of people who were here, and we kind of debated about that, what that was. And what we ended up doing was we created this piece here, what we're called the Cultural Garden. Now it's incomplete at the moment because we have to complete some of the buildings here. The idea was it was a place of reflection, a calm place, given that the rest of the site, ultimately when there's 30,000 people using it, is going to be very active. So this is the first phase of that there now, and the building you see is the very first new build for DIT on site, or sorry I should say TU Dublin now at this stage, and that's done by RKD Architects, and that was the first interpretation of the master plan for DIT, and has led to further interpretations further on, which I'll show some images of. These are also some other images of the site as it now stands, where we were trying to marry the old characteristics of the site, what was good, and give it a new meaning, a new sense of place. Just where that is here, in this location here, up until around 2013, that was all walled off by Lelandia trees, big bushes, and high fences, about 3 metres high, and there was just a patch of grass where people who were only residents, they were kept secure in those buildings. People who were there 20, 30 years, who were in what's called the ICU unit, a high dependency unit, and they were only allowed to go around. The only thing they could do was go around in the square all day, every day. It was a very, very sad place. So to be able to turn that around and give it a new life, and give them also, they were moved into a new facility, a Phoenix Care Centre, which was kind of the equivalent of going from a crappy little hostel to a 4-star hotel, where they were going from 20-year stays to best practice internationally of 3 months, longest. So, and the drugs bill that was used for this, the new facility, was reduced by a third within a matter of months. So the impact of the new built environment was to have a new meaning, or a real impact on the people who use the buildings. So it's kind of things like this. Now, actually, sadly, this is one of my favourite views. But that tree fell down there 3 weeks ago, and I've been told this morning that the balance of the trees have to go; they're rotten, which is quite unfortunate because it was quite a special little spot to be. These are some other spaces that we built. This is a community garden we built down at the bottom of the site, in reference to a little community garden that had kind of popped up over time from some of the staff members, and we create that a little bit. This is a view, which I told you about the border landscape, looking across the fields and out to the city beyond. And just that wall there now that I mentioned on Grangegorman Upper, this is what we've done with it now. Sorry, whoops. This is it now. We've taken down that wall and it's now open and accessible to anyone and everyone. So when we opened the site in September 14, it was the first time anyone could freely walk from North Circle Road down through the site and across through here. Subsequently, through agreement with the shopping centre just beyond, as you can see through here, we've got a managed little access through, which you can now go from Prussia Street through for the first time. And just now, in the last 2 months, we have opened up, for the first time, I've yet to see a drawing going back a couple of 100 years to see people coming from here, from Grangegorman Lower, out to Constitution Hill. That's the King's Inns there, you see at the top of the page. You can go through there, down through Henrietta Street and out to Bolton Street. So this link from here through to there, that has not been possible for hundreds of years, except breaking over walls and what have you. So this opening, albeit very modest, Connor, maybe your hand, he designed it. But this is what we're trying to achieve. We're trying to make this thing in, albeit it's quite modest at the moment. That's it there now, me on a Dublin bike trying to get through to the back of the clock tower, the original penitentiary. But these are the things that are proving very, very popular. I look out at this every day, and it started off in dribs and drabs. But every time I look out now, I'm seeing 10, 12 people coming across here and linking in from Broadstone through to here and out into Grangegorman, Pusher Street beyond. It's nice. It's a nice thing to be able to do. This is that same link now coming through, and on the right hand side is a building that's currently on site, what we call the E Squad. It's the School of Social Media and Arts for DIT, and beyond that now we will eventually have a link through here, through this active spaces. These spaces now are being used by an awful lot of different groups. This was the Dax Interlace Walk there earlier on, at the end of last year. So it was reflecting back the mental health history of the site. It was one of the key places to do it. We walked around the whole site there early one morning. And this is one of the key links that TII and DCC are actually doing the work on it. They're doing the hard area at the moment. This is going to be a new plaza entering into Grangegorman. So just beyond that is our lands. What you see there will be eventually be a mixed-use development, science and technology park hopefully, for employers who will have links in with TU Dublin and HSE. That is now about to start on site. Currently it's ordered off. You've got the Lewis is already on site there. That work will be complete this time next year. So site construction are starting on that now in the next few days. I just want to touch on one other thing that was part of this whole connections thing. It kind of came back to us, a meeting we had about 2 years ago. Our board pulled together all the four of the key stakeholders. We had Tony Brown from the HSE and his team, we had the president from DIT and his team and his governing body, we had Owen Keegan and his team from DCC, and we had people from the civil service, including the Secretary General for Education. And we got them all together and we started to discuss what they really saw as being what they wanted to get out of the site. And the one thing they all said was about connectivity. So be it the physical connectivity, which led to the uplift of the surrounding neighbourhood, the connectivity between the people who are using the site and the residents in the area, the connectivity between the organisations themselves, so HSE starting on research projects with TU Dublin, or GCC working in with them, and then other parts of the public sector starting to come in and feed in with us. But there's other things as well. We went into the public arts piece. We do an awful lot of community engagement to try and get people in and feel that it's their site. It's not our site. It doesn't belong to TU Dublin. It doesn't belong to HSE. It's everyone. So we built this high quality public realm. It's very, very rare we get incidents of vandalism. We do occasionally get some levels of antisocial behaviour, but for where it is on site and what we thought it might be, it's extremely rare. As a matter of fact, I can almost name you the 2 weeks where it happens every year. It's just as school finishes. And they're looking for something to do. But it's well managed by TU Dublin. So, but one of the key things is getting in there. Local employment is another key piece that we do. We do engage very meaningfully with the contractors, and they see a big win out of this. At the moment, which is unexpected given the high level of employment at the moment, we have about 25% of new jobs going to local people in the area, and that's verifiable. We have DIT and the contractors are working on new apprenticeship programs, and then we have this ABC program is another one where we're trying to get early learning in with through DIT and others. We're working with a lot of other public agents to deal with people who have learning disabilities or who have a tough time getting into education. There's obviously public art. We're about to announce probably the next month or two a major public sculpture. The local clubs and societies, local clubs, sports clubs and schools all use the pitches. It's all managed through DIT. We work heavily with National Transport Authority and DCC to improve the local transport, so Bus Connect is a big thing for us at this moment of time. And then, as I say, connecting all these as far as the communities. So we do have to engage them to make them aware of things as well as just building the physical things. And that's that's where we are. That's what we've been doing. That's it.
So thanks to the organisers for inviting me, and so I think it's a really good time to actually reflect on Dublin's redevelopment over the last number of years, and it's not something we do very often really, or do very well. So I think the last two talks have been very good at kind of explaining and outlining different kind of facets of that. So what I'm going to kind of do, and what we've been asked to do part of this talk, is to kind of look at the juxtaposition between new redevelopment in the City of Dublin and the persistence of vacant spaces. So I want to kind of maybe flip this a little bit in the talk and talk a little bit about the ways in which vacancy plays a role in the development of the city. So we often kind of think about vacancy as something which is, opposed to land which is developed or which is in use. And I want to kind of make the argument that vacancy is always a kind of key characteristic of the development of the city as it goes along. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the last 10 years in Dublin, so particularly the period following the crisis, and try to tell a little bit of a story about vacancy based on research I've been doing, which has looked at how vacant spaces in the city of Dublin have been contested after the crisis. So in general, the kind of outline with this would be that in the period following the crash, when we had a slowdown in property development, there was a lot of possibilities kind of came about through the reuses of vacant space. These were often kind of grassroots possibilities which were used in general to kind of rethink about how we do urbanism, rethink about the development priorities in the city and what we should do with them. But as the property market has come back in Dublin, a lot of those possibilities have diminished, have been lost, and we're in danger again of kind of returning to a very commercial city. And so in a kind of period where maybe we're able to take stock following the crisis, there's lessons to be learned maybe in terms of how we do development and how we might more carefully kind of try to account for and plot in these things. So I want to try to kind of make three kind of key arguments, I suppose, in kind of short space of time. So first is to kind of talk a little bit about how in the period following the crisis, vacancy becomes visible, becomes politicised for different sets of actors or different sets of groups. And the different sets of groups look at the possibilities of vacancy, but these possibilities are very different. Secondly, then I want to kind of argue that we need to maybe move away a little bit from simplified views of vacancy, which just sees as the opposite of space which is being developed or which is in use. And I want to argue that vacancy is a key component of urban property markets, and what the market determines as appropriate use is not necessarily the best outcome for the public in all instances. And thirdly, then I want to argue that the set of actors involved in planning and development of Dublin significantly changed in the period following the crisis, and that urban policy in some ways is maybe struggling to find new ways to adapt to these conditions and is not maybe getting the best outcomes that it proposes. So just going to start with this building here, which you're probably all familiar with, which is the ruins of the old Anglo-Irish Bank building on the Dublin Docklands. So vacancy was a key component of Ireland's crisis narrative, particularly around ghost estates as a key iconic symbol of the property crash. But this discussion also entailed debates about the levels of vacancy that persisted in a city like Dublin. So, as Ger's talk kind of talks about, it's quite rare maybe to get a sight of the extent of Grangegorman, and that vacancy is much more kind of, pocketed around the city in little bits and pieces or parcels. And so part of the discussion in the period following the crash, when we had kind of a slowdown in development and suddenly, planning offices weren't getting inundated with new planning applications, was that the City of Dublin, despite a period of intensive redevelopment, had large portions of vacant space. Along with that then, there was also these kind of developments which were sort of new and unfinished or new and empty, and they became a kind of way in which debates were also happened about the extent to which we might question the priorities of development during the Celtic Tiger period, to the extent to which we might kind of seek to kind of find different ways of doing urban development in the city. So the Anglo ruins are one of the things that were identified through that, and one of the proposals at the time put forward was from the architect Pasquamani, who suggested this vision of a vertical park, which he called Trees on the Quays. So essentially to retain the structure of the kind of half-finished building, but implement kind of a greening project in that to open up the space as a public space. And so this was both a way to kind of commemorate the period of the crisis, but also kind of critiquing it, and to kind of give back some of those sites as a site of public use. So as people are also probably familiar, that didn't happen, and the building has subsequently been redeveloped as new headquarters of the Irish Central Bank. And I think this is sort of indicative of some of the trajectory of vacant spaces in the period following the crisis. That there's a lot of possibilities for alternatively thinking about how we might do the city. There's a lot of different kind of proposals put in place which actually question some of the development priorities and values here in the Celtic Tiger. But a lot of the cases what we kind of end up with is a similar, very similar kind of redevelopment of a very commercial city. So I want to spend a bit of time talking through kind of like the three kind of issues I talked about. So in the period following the crisis, I suggested there's a whole dearth of development going on, and there's a whole range of possibilities for, in the first instance, kind of quite grassroots interventions in vacant spaces. So this is things like community gardens or urban agriculture. It's things like independent spaces given over to cultural institutions that are paying kind of quite cheap rents in these sort of empty buildings. It's more formalised kinds of temporary use projects or cultural temporary use projects. And it also entails kind of a bit more recently maybe some kind of contentious activist occupations of vacant properties, partly as a way to highlight homelessness and housing crises. But what all these kinds of interventions had in common, you could argue, was that they used the resource of vacancy for activities not possible within a highly commercial city. And they also tried to lead by example in the sense of using these as experiments in terms of how we might think about the city differently or implement different kinds of development priorities. Policymakers also caught on to these kinds of activities and became interested in them over time. So a number of new policy measures were put in place by the likes of Dublin City Council. So for example, pioneering the vacant land levy as an attempt to kind of combat land hoarding and speculation, but also kind of putting in more softer measures to encourage things like temporary uses or cultural uses of vacant spaces. And so while kind of grassroots in various different ways propose alternative futures, the policy agenda in that regard was to kind of use some of these types of bottom-up activities as a way of kickstarting or stimulating new forms of regeneration. And so the assumption under this kind of approach then is that we can kind of combine the sort of interesting, innovative things that are going on in these sites with redevelopment agenda and keep those two things going where you have commercial investment and a lively city. However, at the same time as these kind of things were going on, we also had a quite broad-scale agenda to solve the crisis. And in particular, that's kind of financial strategy that comes into the city. So particularly through the creation of NAMA, which became a major kind of player in the urban land markets, there was a really dramatic kind of shift in terms of land ownership within the city and in terms of who the major players in development were. So in this kind of sense, financial actors, NAMA and private equity funds on an international level would see vacant space, so somewhere like Docklands, for example, where NAMA had or controlled about 85% of the development land in what became the strategic development zone of Docklands, would have seen vacant spaces or buildings as distressed assets and looked at a strategy then to connect local real estate to global finance as a way of resolving this. But as I'll talk about a little bit, this brings with it its own set of kind of pressures in terms of what types of development are made permissible by that. So the second argument I want to make then is that some of the ways in which we can look then at the trajectory of vacant spaces in the period following the crisis shows us that we maybe don't understand vacancy all that well. There's often quite sort of maybe simplified arguments that are put in place that, we have a certain amount of vacant buildings, we have a certain amount of use that they could be put to, or that we have vacant buildings and we should therefore attract new forms of regeneration to solve those vacancies. So the Dublin City Council Development Plan, for example, suggests that vacancy is a great challenge and opportunity for the city, and they make the argument in this regard that other cities don't have completely fitted out urban cores. Vacancy then provides an opportunity for new forms of investment. But this simple kind of dichotomy between vacancy sites which are either in use or not in use kind of hides a number of other processes going on. So I want to just suggest kind of two processes. So in one sense, it hides the kind of social functions or uses that vacant spaces might already be put to. So in some senses, vacant is not always not in use. It could be just that the use is not maybe what certain actors within the city would see as optimum or appropriate kinds of use. So spaces that are vacant are often maybe used as cultural spaces, used as for different kinds of political meetings or organisations. Sometimes they're used in very informal ways. So like vacant kind of green areas in the city can be used as informal types of walking spaces or parks, etc. And so what this doesn't get at then is sort of the ways in which we might see those social uses and the ways in which regeneration might also then challenge those social uses, and are we asking questions about the extent to which these social uses are carried forward into whatever regeneration takes place. Secondly then, it kind of ignores or undermines the way in which vacant spaces are already kind of in economic use of some sort. Even if this economic use is, around land speculation or land hoarding, or an attempt to kind of maybe amass a larger site at a later date, or to speculate on land prices or property prices increasing in the future as a way to kind of make different types of interventions in the urban landscape after that. So I would argue that missing those 2 points, when we fail to grapple with the real causes of vacancy and its relationship to the types of urban transformation taking place, and thinking a bit more about these aspects can maybe help us have a bit more of a nuanced view about how we can maybe attach policies to these kinds of solving these kinds of issues. So to kind of bring us back then to the kind of period following the crisis, in particular the kind of the most recent phase, right? So as I suggested, the whole set of development actors involved in urban development in Dublin has shifted quite substantially in the last couple of years. And so this is, brought in one sense, a whole new set of international financial actors who are, invested in redeveloping the city. And what this kind of shows us, I think, maybe is the extent to which some of the assumptions in urban policy are maybe failing to grapple with this kinds of transformations going on. And to give you quite a couple of examples of this. So a strategic development zone in Dublin Docklands, for example, aims to be a model of sustainable inner-city regeneration incorporating socially inclusive urban neighbourhoods. But a lot of these kind of priorities are sort of, as we see the types of development that's taken place so far, maybe failing to achieve these kinds of goals. So 2 kind of key components of key urban problems at the moment are around the housing crisis. So rents in Dublin have increased by about 65% since 2010, a low point there. And we also have, a big crisis around homelessness, housing insecurity, and particularly new forms of family homelessness. So having close to 3,000 children growing up in emergency accommodation, I would see as a clear sign of some failures around policy in regard to housing. There's also kind of failure of urban policy models to provide some of the vibrant cultural kind of environments that they propose to do. So many of the kind of grassroots cultural spaces that emerged in the period following the crash have been squeezed out by rising rents as property markets come back up and running. They've been squeezed out by the new types of development that's taking place. So in regard to Smithfield, for example, which was an area which had a lot of cultural spaces in the period following the crisis, a number of these institutions have been moved on or evicted due to rent increases. And Smithfield is an area which is identified as a cultural hub through plans from the City Council, and some of these plans are not going to bear fruit. Similarly with the STZ, newspaper reports in the Irish Times today suggested that only 26 social homes have so far been delivered or committed through the almost 1,200 apartments have been granted planning permission. And media reports from last year suggested that only about 1% of the space and new development in that area is given over to cultural uses. So what we have is kind of an intensification of quite commercial interests in that space. And that's an outcome, I would argue, of both the set of new development actors involved, so the type of financing has changed quite substantially in the period following the crisis. There's new kind of international financial actors whose model is often based on kind of maybe a long-term, return on investment over periods of years, but is very much kind of a model driven by kind of investors and shareholders, and therefore more profitable uses are often going to be more attractive. So in this regard then, I would argue that there's a clear argument to be made for more intensive or more targeted forms of government intervention. So Dublin in 2019, development's once again happening at a rapid speed, and we rarely reflect on the scale of transformation and what kinds of things might be lost in this process. But we need to do better at this and learn lessons from both Vacancy and the kinds of things that happened with that, and also learn lessons from some of the mistakes of the Celtic Tiger. So I'd argue that in the period following the crash, there's a lot of good things that have come out of kind of grassroots examples. And some of those things could be held on to in, as development picks up again. We could think more about the ways in which we kind of ensure the sustainability of some of these kinds of activities. The gap between policy objective and development realities shows the need for more serious and targeted forms of intervention. And so in one sense you could say there's a clear argument for ring fencing forms of public land, for public kinds of functions, whether it be cultural types of functions, whether it be for affordable housing, these kinds of activities. But there's also opportunities here, I think, to kind of like to learn from some of these mistakes and to stem at least some of the tide of these transformations and reassert the role of the public city. So in particular, given Trinity's new plans for an innovation campus in Docklands, there's an opportunity for the university here to be, a leader in this regard, or to lead by example, and to pioneer new approaches to urban development that make significant and perhaps radical interventions to protect spaces, public spaces for urban life outside of purely commercial lodges.
Thank you very much to all three of our speakers for three incredibly insightful talks. I would like to invite you to come up to the table if you wouldn't mind, and I'll open the discussion to the floor. If there are any questions, just raise your hand, we'll bring a microphone over to you. Any questions from the floor?
Thank you. Thank you for that. I have a question for both Ger and Cian, which was really kind of follows on from both of the talks. What public policy changes do you think we should make, or particularly in over a decade or so of working in Grangegorman, what change would have actually enabled you to do this better and quicker in terms of public policy?
I'm not sure about policy. I mean, the one thing that's delayed us has been, the things that have kind of inhibited or slowed us down have been with regard to money and procurement risk and things like that. So it's the implementation of those rules and regulations. Policies, at policy level, we've enjoyed kind of taking all the policies and implementing them all together in one go. And so nothing comes to mind from our point of view, other than if someone gave us a lot more money. That'd be the policy I'd like.
Just to follow on, so I thought Ger's examples gave very good examples of the way in which they're kind of thinking a bit more broadly about that project. And it's striking maybe the difference in terms of those two STZs. So in the Grangegorman example, there's a lot kind of emphasis put on sort of like permeability, creating kind of public spaces. Whereas if you look at, say, the STZ in Docklands and what's kind of changed since the last development plan kind of went, is that really you have a quite broad development plan which entails kind of, having community involvement, has a lot more kind of facets to it, to a new plan which is very commercial by comparison. And so even in that regard, I was reading through the plan for the STZ, so the outline plan for it recently, and a lot of what they're kind of planning to deliver, or what they aim to deliver in the neighbourhood, is not really kind of panning out so far, at least. So one of the things I mentioned is around kind of this space being suitable for families, supposed to have more affordable homes within it, trying to create these kind of public spaces where, if you look at what development is actually taking place, it's very much guided, I think, by kind of maximising commercial returns, and you can see some of that even in regards to the types of planning permissions that are gone in, or even the extent to which, say, in recent developments, some developments changed planning permission from 2-bedroom apartments to 1-bedroom apartments. Again showing maybe that it's like a kind of bottom line kind of aspect of that's being prioritised. So I would see that, so because of maybe the scale of some of the kinds of ways in which those developments, at least in those areas, are being financed at the moment, I would say that there's maybe an argument to be made for the government kind of taking a stronger role in kind of like positioning kind of what they want to retain from the site, or putting stronger planning regulations in terms of minimum amounts of standards of public space, cultural space, in terms of affordable housing. And some of that is maybe more difficult in the sense that would retrospectively be going back to deals that are already made, but it's those kinds of interventions that we see as necessary.
Thank you. Are there
Cian, that's very interesting that you just say that. Your last point, you kind of referred to the government.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering why not the city.
Well, that's city, yeah.
It's
So
like,
when I say government, I mean...
Why isn't the city, isn't the city thinking this way? As you said, the city's put in place that plan, the STC.
Yeah.
And it's, has all these ambitions and goals, and yet it doesn't seem to have any of the maybe the powers necessary to try and implement it in some ways, but I'd say it's probably a little bit more complex than that.
Yeah.
But it's funny that we just refer back to the government as if we have this kind of very centralised view of how we develop our city, but we really should be trying to do that much better at a local level.
Yeah, so I agree with that, maybe a little bit of a slip of the tongue. So, I mean, to unpack that a little bit, I think that where kind of SDZ blurs the lines a little bit between what's national government and what's local government, I think that the City Council is very clearly the agent responsible for this, but a lot of the kind of the impetus and kind of lobbying behind the SDZ comes from sort of groups like NAMA, or an agency like NAMA, for example, which is essentially kind of national level economic policy. And I think that in one sense that plan or plan like that is driven by the demands of national economic policy to A, kind of sort out some of the land bank and problems with sort of distressed debt that come from the crash, and B, to kind of continue on the investment in FDI in that area of the city that was coming out stream with the tech industry. So I think that in one sense you have a kind of a little bit of a mismatch in an area like that like where some of the broad narratives of the broad impetus for some of that plan is shaped at a national level, but it's kind of administered at a local level. And I think I would like to see actually the City Council have a bit more power and a bit more teeth maybe to kind of enforce some of the kinds of things that hope for. Yeah. And so I mean the development plan has lots of like really good kind of ideas in it, and it's a lot more in the development plan. The point I was trying to make wasn't to kind of critique the plans themselves. I think that like the way in which policy or urban policy the City Council have adopted some of these changing conditions after the crisis is really quite positive. It's the extent to which they can ensure that the kinds of urban design and landscape and the kinds of conditions that they want to put in place are delivered on the projects. There's a bit of a gap there, I think, which could be filled better.
Thank you.
Kind of a couple of questions. I guess, Ger, is it possible to give us a bit of an update just on the development of Grangegorman, particularly the quads and student accommodation?
The quads, okay, so what we built to date, okay, we've got about 7% of our footprint there, out of 400,000 square metres. What we have is we've refurbished 5 or 6 protected structures, and they're occupied by about 1,200 DIT students at this moment in time. And we have developed obviously a new replacement mental health facility for St Brendan's. That's working quite happily, and the new primary care. For the rest of HSE, we're working on a new residential nursing home facility called the Neighbourhood. That will be delivered over the next few years. That's a big project now, about 100 beds and plus a lot of other facilities, which will go right beside the primary care centre. For DIT on site, we have 2 big academic buildings currently being built through a PPP process. They started on site March last year. They should be finished and occupied September next year. They will bring about 10,000 students on site. So that's the next big step change. What that does is it allows us to release a lot of DIT property which are currently on the market now. We're going to go into the market very soon, and that will fund a new library. There'll be a new replacement for Ranger Street going on site, opening in September 21, probably called the West Quad. These buildings are designed by O'Donnell Toomey, are doing the library. Hennigan Town are doing the West Quad. The residential care neighbourhood are people who did this building, Culmullen. We have Grafton's doing a primary school, which is about to go to tender in the next couple of weeks. And when that suite of projects are finished, we'll be about 40% of the way through of delivering that 400. That'll be finished around 22, 23, that whole balance of projects. We are also starting early planning on a couple of other projects to follow on from that. Our student accommodation, which we have been at for about 5 years now at this stage, we still haven't got to market. And the big reason behind that comes from EU rules and national policy rules around balance sheet treatment, which has been a bit of a pain in the neck. But that is stalling us at this moment in time. So we're currently working with government on how to deliver these things without impacting on balance sheet. And that's a very, very tricky piece. We've done all the, we've got all the paperwork ready for a couple of different routes to go to market, but getting permission is a different thing. That's a key part of the street accommodation for us in bringing life to the city and our kind of main street coming through the site. The last thing we want to do is have no one there after 7 o'clock at night or whatever. So having people living on the street is a big part of the success of that. So it's something we're going to have to deliver one way eventually.
Can I ask Melanie a question? Dublin is of course famed for its Georgian architecture, so is there, and it's obviously like tourist attraction as well, but is there a sense of putting emphasis on those more dense areas like the Georgian Mile, sort of at the expense of those standalone buildings? And with that in mind, what does the future hold for number 42?
Yes, there probably is. The fact that it does stand alone is the real shame here. But there are much greater parts of the North Georgian city that don't stand alone, and they are being neglected, and much of the buildings there are in disuse and vacancy, and I'm not considering them in the positive sense of vacancy. So yes, there is more of a swing towards the south side, or more bias in that regard. With regard to number 42 and its fate, it was proposed to be part of the redevelopment plan of the Carlton site in 2007. It was part of the Chartered Land Consortium that was subsequently acquired by UK property group Hammerson's in 2015. And planning permission was granted for a large redevelopment of a commercial area spanning Parnell Street and Moore Street. And number 42 is proposed to be a gallery space with public access. It's the only fully protected structure on 18th century structure on O'Connell Street, and the rest of the protected structures are only their upper facades. So all of number 42 has to be retained and was due to be restored using best conservation practices. Currently, nothing is happening. Planning permission, I've been told by Dublin City Council, lapsed in 2018. Another source says that they reapplied and that they have 2 more years for that original planning permission to go through, but it is believed that the Hammerson's group will reapply this year and propose an alternative use. So what that use will be is yet to be announced. We don't have information.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually on that. I'm on Dublin City Council.
The microphone just there.
I was going to ask actually that very question. Had you seen the plans, Hammerson's plans, for the redevelopment of O'Connell Street and Moore Street? I'm a Dublin City Councillor and I'm on a Moore Street Advisory Group, and it's been a bit of a battle over a number of years because there was a High Court judgment 2 years ago which actually declared the entire area a battlefield site worthy of National Monument status, but that was overturned by the Court of Appeal. So I was just wondering if you actually had seen the plans that Hammerson, the UK retail company, had proposed, which would see a huge new pathway through from O'Connell Street through Moore Lane, which is the old Brickfield Lane, which would actually destroy a lot of the 19th and I think 18th century fabric. There's a lot of 18th century cellars around Moore Lane. So just your opinion on that, because it is the only plan. The Dublin City Council's planning department actually have a big graphic design of Chartered Land's former vision for it, so we know clearly where their interests lay. So I just wonder if you had anything further to say on that.
The new plan, I haven't seen it, so I couldn't speculate. The original plan that was permission was granted, it has its issues, serious issues, not just with O'Connell Street, but obviously the Moore Street site and such a sensitive site within the city core. And one of the major issues I would have is the partially what Cian has been touching upon, the lack of consideration for social use and cultural use and inclusivity as a city streetscape. That it will become an enclosed, what the original idea an enclosed commercial area, so financially and economically driven, but with little consideration about its original or continued use as an interactive space within this city.
Okay, just one more question. Two, Ger, yourself. Just, you said 25% of the employment on the project was local. If you could just say something on that. And then, Cian, yourself, just related to what Melanie finished off saying there, it's hugely frustrating in terms of the development plan is a 2-year process. We go through it, many meetings, many hours. But it seems as if, in practice, that the elected officials of the City Council are looking for ways to either leverage the assets to entice private interests to develop sites or to facilitate private interests, capital, and that's really reshaping the city, or has reshaped the city over the last 30 years in particular, and there seems to be an intensification of that process. So in terms of when you say state intervention, how do you actually see that occurring?
Will I go first, yeah? When we were starting our kind of major part of development back around 2011-ish, we developed an employment charter, and that we kind of looked at all these EU law issues with regard to forcing people to employ, all that kind of stuff. So what we did was we came up with a scheme where we said, well, you know what the best person to get any contractor is at tender. So we asked every contractor, if you want this job, would you like to sign up to this thing? Our local employment charter, which has contractual conditions, which looks at how you can bring people in into their when they're bringing in new people, not everyone on site, but create new jobs for that job. Because you know they will have their own permanent staff, so we don't want them to get rid of those permanent staff, bring in someone new. So, but you will bring in new people for each job, for a year or two. So we devised this kind of legal procurement strategy that got around that, and all our contractors signed up to it. But to do that, we also understood that you had to have a support network that went with that, so that they didn't have to go do the hard yards. So we leveraged all the current, the local employment office, all of those good things, and we brought all those people together. We have a Grangegorman Labour and Learning Forum that is chaired independently, that brings in all of these bodies with DIT, etc. So Bridget McManus, the ex-Secretary General of Education, would chair that, and we would provide an employment coordinator who would go out to, we gather in people who want to work on site, their skills, or if they don't have any skills, we predict what skills will be needed in the next 6 months, year, like carpentry or general operative or whatever it might be, working in the canteen, anything to do with working on site. And we predict what those are and give them advanced training. And we give the names and addresses then to the contractors, and they're more than happy to employ these local people, because it means that it saves them the power of going out and trying to hire someone. What was surprising to me in the latest round was given full employment, how like the local people who would be easily employable would be employed now at this stage. So we would be going for people who had difficulty getting back into the market because they were long-term unemployed. So we have been working on that aspect, and we thought that was going to be much harder to get up to those levels. But so far there's been an awful lot of people, and that's only one big contract that we have, but they have been very successful in getting people in, which I found surprising, but it's been nice.
Yeah, okay, it's a pretty big question, I think. So, I mean, I think there's a number of kind of components. So, in one sense, I think that we're still very much affected by the decisions that are made in response to the crisis. And so, when the property market crashed and when kind of large interventions like bank bailout and NAMA were created, I think that they set in play a number of conditions that we're still dealing with now. So, in one sense, a lot of the development land in the city has been kind of transferred or sold. At the time, as far as I know, there's no real conditions that were put in place about that sale, about that landowners would have to develop in a certain number of years or anything like that. So, to a certain extent, we're stuck partly with kind of the system what we have there, and because we've got a small number of quite large landowners now, they have considerable power in terms of when land is developed, or to what extent or to what use is developed. But I think that we often kind of maybe forget or think that we can only kind of go that pro-market or go that market route. And so I was at an event earlier in the week, which is looking at kind of how different cities around the world kind of or in Europe, I suppose, have responded to issues around vacancy. And different cities have very different kinds of sets of challenges. So I mean, a city like Dublin is, essentially not somewhere where you need to attract investment quite substantially, I would think. It's a metropolitan city, it's got a strong economy, so it doesn't have the same kinds of challenges as second-tier cities might have in terms of stimulating regeneration. Also, that we can maybe insist on having greater public growth. So for example, this presentation looking at cities like Berlin, which decided to put a very large-scale public park in the middle of the city, and the decision was made to devote that land to a public park. And so something like that is potentially possible. Other sort of maybe more targeted kind of solutions is like a greater use of things like planning gain. So the idea that in order for planning permissions to be granted on development, certain amounts of public infrastructure need to be given back in return, and a greater kind of insistence on that. There's also talk about kind of maybe extending these out over a longer time period. So planners in London, for example, are looking at things like if you make a valuation on what the development is going to achieve in terms of a couple of years, if in 10 years down the line the development has made greater value or it's increased its profits more than that, there's potential to go back and ask for additional planning gain on the basis of that increase in value. So none of these things are necessarily easy to negotiate, but I think it's like a conversation that needs to be had in terms of where the city sees itself, what kinds of demands the city might make in terms of not only attracting investment and development, but also kind of shaping that towards getting something out of that for the public.
Thank you.